I was paying for a small Christmas cake at the cafe when I heard a voice that froze me in place. It was warm and confident, too familiar to ignore. Behind me, through the hum of soft carols and clinking cups, I heard my daughter-in-law, Amelia, talking to a friend. "Just wait till Christmas dinner," she said, her tone dripping with excitement. "Everyone will finally see what kind of man he really is. Broke pretending to be noble." Her laughter cut through the cozy air like glass. I didn't move. She had no idea I was standing 2 feet away, the reflection of her red coat flickering in the cafe window beside me. For a long second, I stared at my own face in the glass, old and still holding a paper bag that suddenly felt too heavy. That moment I realized Christmas wouldn't be about forgiveness. It would be about truth. Outside, the Vermont air bit at my skin as I stepped into the cold. Snow drifted down from a colorless sky, coating the streets in soft silence. I walked slowly to my truck, my pulse steady, but my thoughts racing. I'd raised my son Thomas to believe in decency. I'd taught him that money comes and goes, but character stays. Yet somehow, I'd let him marry a woman who measured people by their wallets. As I drove home, the radio played Silent Night. The irony wasn't lost on me. My name is Richard Hale, 66 years old, retired. Or at least, that's what everyone thinks. People say I used to be somebody. I once ran Hale Contractors, a family-owned construction company that built half the houses in this town. My logo used to sit proudly on every job site, until the crash of 2020 came along, and I refused to fire a single employee. The banks took the rest. They said I'd lost everything. Maybe I did in dollars, but not in principles. Now I live alone in a modest house just outside Burlington. Small, quiet, filled with ghosts of better years. Every morning I wake early, brew 1 cup of black coffee, and read the paper like it still matters. Most of my neighbors think I'm just an old man who never quite recovered from a bad run of luck. And maybe that's true. I don't correct them. People are more comfortable when you fit their stories. Thomas, my only son, visits when he can. He's 38, works in finance, dresses better than I ever did, and always seems a little too tired for his age. Amelia, his wife, comes along sometimes. She smiles for the photos, calls me Dad, and glances at my old Ford like it's a prop from another era. From the start, I sensed she didn't marry for love alone. She loved appearances, attention, and above all, the thrill of being admired. I tried to ignore the small remarks she made, the way she'd compliment me for staying positive, despite the bankruptcy, or the time she laughed about my house being so quaint like something out of a Hallmark movie. It didn't matter. I told myself to keep peace for Thomas's sake. He already carried too much. I'd rather swallow my pride than make him choose between us. But hearing her at that cafe changed everything. Her words weren't careless gossip. They were planned cruelty. I could hear the excitement in her voice when she said, "He still thinks no one knows. Wait till they see his face." I knew exactly what she meant. Amelia loved a crowd. And Christmas dinner at their house was the biggest gathering of the year. Half the family, friends, colleagues, everyone who ever shook my hand when I was still Mr. Hale. Hal. By the time I reached home, the sky had darkened. The house creaked in the cold, and the furnace hummed like an old dog trying to breathe. I set the cake on the counter untouched. My reflection in the kitchen window looked back at me, weary but not beaten. I'd been humiliated before, but never by family. Never by someone who should have protected Thomas's trust. That betrayal cut deeper than any financial loss ever could. I sat down at my desk, the same oak desk I'd bought 40 years ago when I signed my first contract. My hands rested on its worn surface. I thought about Amelia's laughter, the smug tone, the certainty that she'd finally expose me. She thought the bankruptcy was a shameful secret. She didn't know it was part of something bigger, something she could never understand. She wanted a spectacle. Fine. I'd give her one. I unlocked the old safe under the desk. Inside were neatly organized folders, bound contracts, and a single brass key. The last remnants of Hale contractors and the beginning of something new. Few people knew that after the company collapsed, I'd started rebuilding quietly under a new name with a trusted friend, Daniel Cole. The business was small, but steady, debt-free, and profitable again. My silence had been my armor. Amelia thought she could weaponize it. I closed the safe and leaned back in my chair. The plan began forming itself in the quiet hum of the furnace. I didn't need to argue, shout, or defend myself. I just needed to let her speak first, to let her believe she'd won. When arrogance exposes itself, all you have to do is step aside and let it fall. Snow tapped against the window like someone knocking gently, asking if I was ready. I smiled faintly. Ready more than ever. I'd spent a lifetime building things that could stand storms. I could handle one more. I poured myself a small glass of bourbon, lifted it toward the empty room, and whispered, "You wanted a show, Amelia. I'll see you at Christmas." Then I wrote one line in my end. The house was cold when I got back from the morning walk. Sunlight bounced off the snow outside, making everything look brighter than it felt. I brewed coffee and sat by the small window that overlooked the quiet street. The world outside looked peaceful, but my mind wasn't. I kept hearing Amelia's voice from that cafe, sharp, amused, certain she held power over me. That kind of arrogance had a way of waking something in me I hadn't felt in years. My house used to be bigger back when Hale Contractors was alive and thriving. I can still picture the old office downtown, the blueprints stacked high, the sound of saws and hammers echoing through the lot. There was pride in that name, not because it made money, but because it built homes people could trust. When the financial storm hit in 2000, everyone told me to cut my workers loose. "You can't save everyone rich," the accountant said. Maybe he was right, but I couldn't look those men in the eye and tell them they didn't matter. So I sold my car, my second property, even mortgaged this little house. I paid every bill, cleared every salary. When it was done, I had nothing left except my conscience. The papers called it a failed legacy. Maybe they were right on paper. But what they couldn't print was the truth that losing money never broke me. What hurt was the silence that followed. Friends stopped calling. Thomas stopped asking questions. Even my neighbors looked at me with pity instead of respect. For a man who'd spent his life standing tall, that kind of quiet was louder than any insult. Thomas had just married Amelia then. She came from a comfortable family in Boston. People who believed status was a language. I still remember her first visit to my old office. She walked around smiling, but her eyes were already judging the worn floors, the smell of dust and wood. Later that night, she'd said to Thomas, "Your dad's business has character, but maybe it's time he modernized." Thomas laughed it off. I didn't. She had the kind of charm that could disguise contempt. After the company closed, I moved into this small place on the outskirts of Burlington. Thomas and Amelia bought a modern home in the city, 3 stories, glass walls, and furniture that looked too fragile to sit on. I visited once a month. Amelia was polite, but her smile never reached her eyes. Every comment she made carried a blade wrapped in silk. "It's sweet that you're still so humble," she'd say when she saw my old truck. Or, "We should help you upgrade sometime." Thomas would change the subject quickly, embarrassed. I let it go. I told myself peace was worth more than pride. Still, every man has a breaking point. Mine came slowly, tiny cuts that built up over time. I remember last Christmas sitting at their table while Amelia talked about how difficult it must be to start over at that age. The room laughed politely, and I smiled along. But inside, something shifted. That's when I learned that silence could be sharper than words if you knew how to use it. After that dinner, I stopped pretending I was done. I started paying attention again. Every morning I'd read financial reports, watch the market, take notes. I wasn't chasing money. I was studying patterns. I had contacts, people who still respected the way I did business. One of them was Daniel Cole, my old project manager. Daniel had stood by me through the worst of it. One day he called out of the blue. "Rich," he said, "I've got an idea. A new kind of contracting firm. Smaller, smarter. I want in, but I need someone who knows how to run a ship." I told him to keep my name off the paperwork. "I'll back it quietly," I said. "No one needs to know I'm involved." He didn't ask why. He just agreed. Now, 2 years later, that little company, Hale Renovations, LLC, was thriving. Not many people connected the dots. The Hale name was common enough, and I'd kept my involvement off the books. I liked it that way. People saw me as retired, harmless. It gave me space to move without drawing attention. And more importantly, it gave me leverage. If Amelia wanted to humiliate me over being broke, I could let her do it. The truth was waiting for her on the other side. I took another sip of coffee and walked to the living room where old photos hung crooked on the wall. One showed Thomas when he was 12, holding a hammer twice the size of his hand, smiling proudly next to a half-built porch. Back then, he used to say, "My dad builds the strongest houses in town." I wonder what he tells people now. Maybe nothing. Maybe he doesn't know what to believe. Part of me blamed him for letting Amelia's attitude take root. But another part knew how easy it was to be blinded by charm. I'd seen it before. She made him feel successful by comparison. She needed someone to look down on, and I was the perfect target. I sat at my desk, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out the folder Daniel had mailed last week. Inside were the latest financials and a letter. "Rich, your 40% is now worth close to $2.5 million. Merry Christmas, old man." I stared at the number not with greed, but with quiet satisfaction. I'd rebuilt what they thought I'd lost. Only this time I didn't owe anyone explanations. The afternoon light dimmed, painting the snow outside in shades of gold. I leaned back in the chair and thought of Amelia's plan, her smug little voice promising to expose me at dinner. She believed the story ended 3 years ago with my bankruptcy. She had no idea she was living in the sequel. I went to the closet and pulled out my old gray suit, the one I hadn't worn since the last board meeting of Hale Contractors. I brushed off the dust and laid it across the bed. It still fit more or less. There was a note of irony in wearing the same suit that once symbolized defeat. Maybe this year it would mean something else. My phone buzzed. An email from Daniel popped up. "Contract signed. You're officially back in business, partner. Congratulations." I exhaled slowly. Timing couldn't have been better. Christmas Eve dinner was less than a week away. I looked out the window again. The street was silent lights, blinking on, one by one across the neighborhood. I thought of Amelia, rehearsing her speech, maybe printing those bankruptcy papers she'd found online. Let her. Let her stand up in front of everyone, proud of her little performance. When she finished, I'd be ready. Truth has its own kind of timing. It doesn't rush. It waits until arrogance gets loud enough to hear itself echo. I poured another drink and raised the glass to the window to the man staring back at me, a little older, maybe a little wiser. "They think I lost everything," I said softly. "Let's keep it that way. For now." Last Christmas, I sat at the end of the long dining table, surrounded by laughter that didn't reach me. The room smelled of rosemary and roasted ham, the kind of warmth that made everyone else comfortable and me feel like an intruder. Amelia was in her element, moving from guest to guest, topping off glasses of wine, flashing that practiced smile that made people trust her. I kept my head down, cutting small pieces of turkey, waiting for the evening to end. Then she said it so casually, so beautifully cruel, I almost admired it. "We all know life isn't easy," she said, raising her glass. but what matters is how you handle failure with grace. Some of us have learned that recently. Everyone chuckled softly, unsure of her meaning. Everyone except me. Her eyes found mine sparkling under the chandelier. We're just so proud, she added, that Dad has accepted his new phase of life with such dignity. I felt the air thicken. Thomas forced a smile. I nodded, pretending not to understand. But I understood perfectly. That was Amelia's specialty, humiliation disguised as kindness. I didn't respond. I raised my glass, touched the rim to my lips, and let the silence swallow her words. It worked better than any retort. Still inside, something cracked. The laughter continued. Forks clinked, but I could barely taste the food. I watched my son glance nervously between us, torn between loyalty and fear of conflict. I didn't blame him. Amelia had built a house of glass, and he was terrified of breaking it. Later that night, when I drove home, the world was quiet. Snow fell in slow motion through the glow of streetlights. The radio played "I'll Be Home for Christmas," soft and hollow. I turned it off. The road ahead was empty, the kind of darkness that forces you to think. I replayed every moment, her tone, her grin, the pity in the eyes around that table. That night I realized something painful but clear. It wasn't just that Amelia looked down on me. It was that Thomas let her. That silence from my son hurt more than any insult she could throw. The man I raised to be strong had chosen comfort over courage. But I also knew I couldn't blame him completely. People change when life gets easy. They stop fighting for what matters. They forget the lessons that built them. I'd seen it happen before. It's easier to keep peace than to defend pride. When I got home, I left my coat on the chair and poured myself a drink. The glass trembled in my hand, not from anger, but from the weight of restraint. Every part of me wanted to call her out in front of everyone, to tell them what she really was, a manipulator hiding behind perfect manners. But I didn't. That night I learned the value of patience. Anger burns too fast. Truth burns slow but steady. I wrote one line in my notebook before bed. When they underestimate you, don't correct them. Just remember, the following months were quiet. I kept to myself, worked odd consulting jobs, and helped Daniel build Hale renovations behind the scenes. Each time a project succeeded, I thought about that dinner table. I imagined Amelia bragging about her husband's promotion, the expensive vacations, the new car. I imagined her pride resting on the illusion that I'd fallen and she'd risen. Let her think that. Some debts take time to mature. I'd see Thomas occasionally. He'd ask if I needed anything, always careful not to stay too long. Amelia would send polite texts about birthdays or holidays. I replied with simple thumbs-up emojis. The less I said, the more space I had to plan. Revenge wasn't a word I liked to use. It sounded childish. What I wanted wasn't revenge, it was balance. I didn't need to make them suffer. I just needed the truth to stand tall again. One evening in late February, I drove past one of my old construction sites. It had been sold to a larger firm, but the original sign was still there, half covered in snow, Hale Contractors. I parked and walked toward it, brushing the snow off the faded letters. My hands were rougher now, but the feeling was the same: ownership pride. I whispered to the cold air, "You can paint over the name, but you can't erase what it built." The wind didn't answer, but I felt lighter walking back to the truck. From then on, I stopped carrying resentment like a wound. Instead, I carried it like a tool, something to sharpen my resolve. Every day I studied markets, read industry reports, called suppliers who still respected me. Daniel and I made smart, quiet moves. No noise, no drama, just solid work. That's what Amelia never understood. Real power doesn't need an audience. As the next Christmas approached, I found myself thinking about that dinner again. The memory still stung, but less than before. I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. People like Amelia believe they can control narratives because others let them. But truth, doesn't bend for long. I'd seen that in business, in marriage, in life. Lies eventually collapse under their own weight. By early December, Burlington was covered in snow again. The lights downtown glowed gold against the cold, and every store window was painted with red ribbons and fake snowflakes. I drove past the cafe where I'd first overheard Amelia's voice. It was full of people laughing, the kind of laughter that hides insecurity. I parked across the street for a moment, staring at the window, then smiled to myself. "Last year, you took my dignity," I whispered. "This year, I'll take back my story." When Thomas called a few days later to invite me to dinner, I said yes, without hesitation. Of course, I told him I wouldn't miss it. My tone must have surprised him, because he paused before saying, "That's great, Dad." "Amelia's excited to see you." I smiled into the receiver. "I bet she is." That night before bed, I looked around the house. The furnace hummed softly, the same steady rhythm that had kept me company for years. I wasn't the man I used to be, the one chasing contracts and deadlines. I was older, slower maybe, but sharper. The kind of sharp that comes from experience, not ego. I stood by the window watching the snow swirl under the streetlight. "Last Christmas, you humiliated me," I murmured to the quiet street. "This Christmas, I'll let you finish the story, but I'll write the ending." The snow kept falling steady and relentless, covering everything in white. The world looked clean again. Inside, so did I. The phone rang just after sunrise. I was in the garage, oiling the hinges on the old workbench, when Thomas's name flashed on the screen. His voice carried that polished cheerfulness he used whenever he tried to smooth things over. "Dad," he said, "we're hosting Christmas dinner again this year." "Everyone's coming. You'll be there, right?" I wiped my hands on a rag and looked out the small window. Snowflakes drifted through the pale morning light. "Of course," I said, evenly. "Wouldn't miss it for the world." He sounded relieved. "Good. Amelia's planning something special this year. She'll be thrilled you're coming." I smiled, though he couldn't see it. "I'm sure she will." When the call ended, I leaned against the counter for a long minute, listening to the quiet hum of the heater. Then I picked up the pencil beside the calendar and drew a small red circle around December 24th. A few hours later, my phone buzzed again. This time it was Amelia. Her tone was warm, sugary enough to coat poison. "Richard, I just wanted to say how happy we are you'll be joining us. Everyone misses your stories. I'll try to bring a few," I said, keeping my voice light. "And maybe one of your famous pies," she added quickly. "The kids loved it last year." "I'll bring something," I replied. "Something small but meaningful." Her laughter rang out perfectly rehearsed. "Oh, you're always so thoughtful. Just wear that dark suit, you know, the one that still fits you so well. You'll look respectable." I let the word hang between us. Respectable. "Thanks for the reminder," I said softly. "See you soon, Amelia." When I hung up, the smile on my face disappeared. It wasn't anger I felt. It was clarity. I knew what she was doing, and I knew she thought I'd play along. Maybe I would, but not the way she expected. That afternoon, I drove downtown to meet Daniel. His office was a modest suite above a hardware store, but the work we did there meant more to me than any office tower ever could. We reviewed the paperwork, the contracts, the final signatures. Daniel grinned, shaking his head. "Rich, you really pulled this off. You could have told your family you didn't have to keep it secret." I folded the documents neatly into my briefcase. "Pride doesn't need an audience," I said. "But truth does." Daniel studied me for a second. "You're planning something." "Let's call it a clarification," I said. "Nothing dramatic. Just the truth at the right time." He laughed. "You always did like perfect timing." "Timing wins wars," I said, standing up. And this one's already over. They just don't know it yet. On the drive home, the sun was low and gold, catching the frost on the trees. I stopped at a small shop on Main Street, the kind that still wrapped gifts in paper and twine. I picked out a silver box and a ribbon, the color of winter steel. Inside, I placed a copy of the contract, a photo from the morning signing, and a small card that read, "To family with love. May honesty be your greatest gift this Christmas." The clerk smiled as she handed me the finished package. "That's a nice message," she said. "It's overdue," I replied. That evening, I stopped by the cemetery before heading home. The snow crunched under my boots as I walked to my wife's grave. I brushed off the headstone with my glove and placed a single white rose on top. "You'd tell me not to stoop to their level," I murmured. "Don't worry, I won't. But I'm done pretending they can walk over me." The wind stirred softly, carrying the faint sound of church bells from town. Back home, I poured a drink and sat by the fire. The house smelled faintly of pine from the small tree I'd set up in the corner. I looked at the silver box on the mantel, the light flickering over its surface. Amelia wanted a performance in audience. She'd get one. But I would decide when the curtain dropped. The next morning, I drove to the tailor to have my old gray suit pressed. The same one I'd worn to my last board meeting the day I'd signed away Hale Contractors. The tailor looked surprised. "Big event." "Something like that," I said. When I got home, I laid the suit out on the bed and polished my shoes. I felt calm, methodical, like preparing for a meeting I already knew the outcome of. I wasn't nervous about facing Amelia. I'd spent too long being underestimated to care. That evening, I received one more email from Daniel, all finalized. Company value estimated at $3.2 million. Happy holidays, partner? I stared at the screen for a moment, the glow reflecting in my glasses. Then I typed back, "Thank you. Tomorrow night will be interesting." The day before Christmas passed quietly. I cleaned the truck, ironed a shirt, wrapped a few small gifts for the grandkids. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I barely recognized the man staring back. Not because I looked different, but because I felt it. There was no bitterness left, only focus. That night, as the snow began to fall again, I sat by the window with a cup of coffee, watching the flakes catch the streetlight. The world outside was still wrapped in silence. I reached for the silver box, ran my fingers over the ribbon, and smiled. "She wanted respect," I whispered. "Tomorrow she'll see what it really looks like." When the clock struck midnight, I set the box beside my coat and turned off the lights. The living room faded into darkness, except for the soft glow from the tree. I stood for a moment, listening to the faint crackle of the fire dying out. This time I said quietly to the room, "I won't come empty-handed." Then I walked upstairs, the floorboards creaking beneath my steps, and the plans settled over me, like the steady weight of snow on the roof. Silent, patient, inevitable. The day before Christmas Eve, I decided to drop off a few gifts early for my grandchildren. The snow had turned the roads into white ribbons, quiet and empty. When I pulled into Thomas and Amelia's driveway, I could see lights glowing warmly from inside. I hesitated for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. I wasn't supposed to be there until the next night, but I wanted to see my grandkids' faces when they opened their presents. I thought that would be the only surprise of the week. I was wrong. I stepped up to the porch and rang the bell. No answer. Through the window, I saw Amelia in the kitchen, phone to her ear, her voice low but sharp. I knocked lightly, expecting her to wave me in. She didn't. Instead, she turned away from the door, pacing with the phone pressed to her shoulder. I was about to leave when her words caught me mid-step. "Trust me," she said, laughing quietly. "It'll be the highlight of the dinner. Everyone thinks he's this noble man, but I'll show them who he really is, a broke pretender." My hand froze on the doorknob. I stayed still, barely breathing, the cold biting at my neck. She moved closer to the counter, setting the phone on speaker. A woman's voice replied from the other end, full of amusement. "Amelia, you're terrible. You really going to do that in front of everyone?" "Oh, come on," Amelia said, her tone gleeful. "He's been lying to everyone for years, pretending he's still successful. I found the old bankruptcy file online. Public records are amazing. I'll print copies for everyone at dinner. He'll have to admit it in front of the whole family." The woman laughed. "You're ruthless." "Please," Amelia said. "It's justice. Maybe then he'll stop acting like he's still important." The words hit like cold water. I felt the sting behind my eyes, the old ache of betrayal. But I stayed rooted in place. I could have walked in, confronted her, stopped it right there. But something deeper held me back, something steady. I'd learned long ago that truth doesn't need defending, it just needs time. I stepped away from the door quietly, my boots crunching on the snow. The laughter from inside faded behind me. I got back in my truck and sat for a while, gripping the steering wheel, listening to the sound of my own breathing. Outside, the world looked peaceful, white and still. But inside, my heart was pounding. She wanted to humiliate me. Not just in front of strangers, but in front of my own son, my family, my name. On the drive home, the roads blurred under the falling snow. I didn't feel angry. Anger was too small for this. What I felt was something older, colder resolve. The kind that makes you choose silence because it's the only weapon they don't expect. I parked outside my house and didn't go in right away. The truck engine ticked in the quiet. Across the street, Christmas lights blinked in warm patterns. Somewhere a radio played carols. I looked at the silver box on the passenger seat, the one I'd prepared days ago, and realized I didn't have to change a thing. I already had everything I needed. Inside the house was dark, except for the glow of the tree. I poured myself a drink, sat at my desk, and opened the safe. The faint smell of old paper and metal filled the room. I took out the thick folder containing the documents Daniel and I had signed earlier that week. The ink was still fresh on the contracts. Hale Renovations, LLC. My company reborn under a name no one had thought to look for. I smiled faintly, turning the first page. If she wants to expose my bankruptcy, I murmured, she should at least check the dates. I picked up the phone and called Daniel. He answered on the second ring. "Rich." "Everything okay?" "Perfect," I said. "I need a favor." "Can we move the press release forward one day?" He hesitated. "To Christmas Eve." "You sure about that?" "Completely. Send it out at noon and film the signing. We'll use it for the company announcement." Daniel chuckled. "You sound like you're planning something." "Not planning," I said. "Finishing." After the call, I sat there for a while, letting the quiet settle around me. The bourbon burned down my throat, warm and clean. On the desk sat my old notebook, its pages filled with years of lessons, notes from contracts, mistakes, triumphs. I turned to the last blank page and wrote one line in neat handwriting. "They mistake humility for weakness. Tomorrow, they'll learn the difference." I closed the notebook and placed it beside the silver box. The plan didn't need details. It was already in motion, and the best part was Amelia would write half of it for me. Her arrogance would do the heavy lifting. Outside, the snow kept falling soft and endless. I stood by the window watching flakes drift past the yellow streetlights. Across the road, a neighbor's kid was building a snowman, his laughter echoing through the cold air. I envied that innocence for a moment, the kind that doesn't yet know how cruel people can be when they think they're winning. I went back to the desk, sealed the documents inside the box, and tied the ribbon tighter. The metal glinted under the lamplight like a secret waiting for its cue. On top, I placed a small tag that read, "Merry Christmas from the man you thought was broke." By the time I finished, it was nearly midnight. The house was silent except for the ticking clock and the faint hum of the heater. I sat back, closed my eyes, and breathed in the stillness. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't even angry anymore. I felt calm, prepared. I thought of Amelia's face when she'd pull out those papers at dinner. Her smug smile as she looked around the table, expecting laughter at my expense. I pictured the way Thomas would shift in his chair, uncomfortable but too loyal to his wife to intervene. And I imagined the exact moment when silence would fall, when I'd stand up steady and composed and unwrap my own gift. I finished my drink and looked around the dim room. The glow from the Christmas tree shimmered against the walls, casting patterns like ripples of light. I raised the glass toward it and whispered, "They want a show. Let's give them one." Then I turned off the lamp, letting the room fall into darkness. The last thing I saw before heading upstairs was the silver box resting on the table, waiting like a promise. Tomorrow, the stage would be hers, but the ending, well, that belonged to me. Morning came slow and pale, the kind of light that makes everything look clean, almost innocent. I woke before dawn, long before the town had stirred. The house was cold quiet except for the creak of the old furnace starting up. I brewed my coffee and sat by the window, watching snow drift across the street. The world was wrapped in white, hiding every flaw beneath a soft disguise. It was a good morning for secrets. On the table beside me lay my list. It wasn't long, just a few things to finalize. Daniel, the contract copies, the USB with the footage, and the gifts. I didn't need more than that. My revenge, if you could call it that, didn't require noise or fire. It needed precision. Amelia wanted chaos. I would give her clarity. I dressed, brushed the snow off the truck, and drove downtown. The streets were quiet, just a few shopkeepers sweeping their steps, breath turning to fog in the cold air. Daniel's office was above the hardware store, warm and cluttered, the smell of coffee and printer ink filling the air. He was already there, sleeves rolled up, grin ready. "You're early," he said. "Big day," I replied, handing him the pen. "Let's make it official." We went over the paperwork, carefully checking every page, every initial. The deal was clean. Hale Renovations LLC now merged into a new partnership, officially recognizing my 40% ownership. It wasn't about the money. It was about the signature, the timestamp, the truth written in ink. Daniel looked at me over the folder. "You could tell your son about this, you know. Might help." I smiled faintly. "He'll learn soon enough." Daniel chuckled. "You sound like a man with a plan." "Not a plan," I said. "A point." He handed me a flash drive containing the video of our signing. "Press release goes out at noon, like you asked. The world will know you're back in business." "Perfect," I said, standing. "Now all that's left is dessert." He frowned, confused, but I didn't explain. On my way out, he called after me. "Merry Christmas." "Rich, Merry Christmas, partner," I said. The air outside stung my face. I stopped at a small toy shop on Main Street. The window display was filled with trains, teddy bears, and wooden puzzles. I picked out a snow globe for my grandson inside a tiny cabin, surrounded by pines, the word truth carved into the base. The clerk wrapped it neatly, tying it with red ribbon. "You've got good taste," she said. "Just lucky," I replied. Before heading home, I made one more stop, the cemetery. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I walked to my wife's grave. The stone was dusted white, the carved letters faint under years of weather. I knelt, brushed it clean, and placed the snow globe on top. "You'd tell me not to get involved," I murmured. "But you'd understand. This isn't vengeance, it's balance." The wind was sharp, carrying the distant sound of church bells. For a moment I felt her beside me, the way she used to hum when she cooked. I closed my eyes, letting the calm settle. "Wish me luck," I said softly, then stood and walked back to the truck. By afternoon, the clouds had thickened the sky, bruised with gray. I spent the next few hours preparing. The silver box sat open on the table, the documents neatly folded inside the signed contracts, the photos from the office, and the letter I'd written in my wife's old stationery. To my family, the truth doesn't need defending. It just needs to arrive on time. I slipped the letter into the box and sealed it with the silver ribbon. Then I printed a single copy of the company announcement, folded it carefully, and tucked it into my jacket pocket. It felt like carrying a quiet kind of weapon. At dusk, the phone rang. It was Daniel again. "Everything's live," he said. "The press release is up on the company's site. Congratulations, Rich. You're trending locally already." I chuckled. "That's one way to start the evening." "You sure you're okay with this going public?" he asked. "You've been quiet for years." "I've been patient," I said. "There's a difference." After we hung up, I sat by the fire with a glass of bourbon. The clock ticked toward 7. Outside, the snow had picked up heavy flakes falling against the window, like whispers. The living room smelled faintly of pine and smoke. I took a long sip, feeling the warmth spread through me. I thought about what was coming the dinner, the looks, the way Amelia's voice would fill the room, before it all fell silent. I could already see the moment she'd realized she'd walked into her own trap. It wasn't joy I felt. It was relief. The kind of peace that comes from knowing the story will finally tell itself. Later, I went upstairs and opened the closet. My suit hung there, freshly pressed, the dark fabric sharp against the pale walls. I placed the folded letter in its pocket and checked my reflection in the mirror. The lines on my face looked deeper, but there was something new in my eyes, calm, not fatigue. I buttoned the jacket, tested the fit, then took it off again. Tomorrow night I'd wear it for the last time, not as a defeated man, but as someone who'd endured and learned. Before bed, I turned off the lights, leaving only the glow from the Christmas tree. The silver box sat on the coffee table, glimmering in the dim light. I whispered to the empty room. They think silence means surrender. Let's remind them what it really means. I climbed the stairs slowly, feeling the weight of years in my bones, but strength in every step. Upstairs, the window was cracked just enough to let in the cold air. I stood there, watching snowflakes swirl in the wind, listening to the faint hum of the world holding its breath. Tomorrow, Amelia would have her moment. She'd get her spotlight, her stage, her audience. I'd let her play the role she'd written for herself. And when the curtain fell, I'd be there too, steady, quiet, holding the truth in my hands. I smiled as I turned off the lamp. "Tomorrow night," I said softly. "We finish the show." By the time I pulled into Thomas's driveway, the snow had stopped falling. The air was crisp, the kind that carried the smell of pine and chimney smoke. The house glowed from the inside, every window lined with golden light, laughter spilling faintly into the cold night. I sat there for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, watching silhouettes move behind the curtains. It looked like something out of a postcard, perfect and polished. That was Amelia's specialty, making everything look flawless from the outside. I reached for the silver box on the passenger seat and placed it carefully under my arm. The ribbon shimmered under the porch light as I walked up the steps. Before I could knock, the door opened. Thomas stood there, smiling awkwardly. "Dad, you made it? Come on in." Warmth hit me immediately, the smell of cinnamon, roasted turkey, and candles. The house was crowded with people, all talking at once, holding wine glasses, plates balanced on napkins. Familiar faces, half of them I hadn't seen since before the bankruptcy. Some greeted me kindly, others avoided my eyes. That was fine. I was here for one reason. Richard, Amelia's voice rang from across the room, high and bright like a bell. She moved toward me in a red dress, her lipstick the same color as the wine in her glass. "You look wonderful," she said, kissing the air near my cheek. That suit still fits you. I knew it would. I smiled faintly. Thanks. You look festive. She laughed and took my arm, leading me through the room as if I were some honored guest she'd personally chosen to display. Everyone, look who's here. Thomas's father, our very own Christmas miracle. Polite applause followed the kind people give when they're not sure what else to do. I nodded to a few guests, pretending not to notice the sideways glances. The living room was beautifully decorated. Amelia's taste, no doubt. White garlands along the mantel, gold ornaments on the tree, everything symmetrical. Even the smiles felt staged. Thomas handed me a drink. You okay, Dad? Perfect, I said. Feels like old times. He looked relieved. Good. I know Amelia really wanted this night to go well. I bet she did. I took a sip and studied my son's face. He looked tired, worn thin by the effort of keeping everyone happy. I'd seen that look before on myself years ago, before I learned the cost of silence. Dinner was called soon after. We gathered around a long wooden table lit by candles and soft music. The children chattered, passing rolls and whispering about presents. Amelia sat across from me, radiant and composed, her hand resting lightly on Thomas's. Every move she made felt rehearsed, every word dipped in sugar. This spread looks incredible, I said, glancing around. Thank you, she replied sweetly. It's a team effort. Thomas carved the turkey and I managed everything else. Of course she did. As plates were passed and glasses filled, conversation drifted toward work weather and the latest local gossip. I said little, watching instead the way Amelia laughed too loudly, the way her eyes flickered toward me every now and then, calculating. She was waiting for something. Halfway through dinner, she caught my gaze and smiled. Dad, you'll be happy to hear Thomas got approved for that business loan. We might even buy that lakeside property soon. That's wonderful, I said. You must be doing well. Oh, we manage, she replied, leaning back in her chair. Of course, it helps to have people in the family who understand finances. There it was, the first spark. I met her eyes evenly. And people who understand honesty, I said. Her smile tightened just slightly. Around us, the table fell quiet for a second before someone changed the subject. The moment passed, but I could feel it, the tension humming under the surface, like a wire about to snap. After dinner, the family moved into the living room for dessert and gifts. The children sat by the tree, their laughter a soft backdrop to the murmurs of adults settling in with coffee and wine. The air felt heavy now, expectant. Amelia was pacing her steps perfectly, waiting for the right moment. Before dessert, she said, suddenly standing near the head of the table, I just want to say something. Thomas looked up, surprised. Amelia, maybe we should... It'll only take a minute, she said brightly, placing a hand on his shoulder. I think it's time we share a little family transparency. After all, Christmas is about truth, isn't it? I stayed still, watching her. The room quieted instantly. She turned toward me, voice soft but sharp enough to cut glass. Richard, I just want to say how much I admire you. Truly, it takes real strength to keep smiling after difficult financial times. A murmur rippled through the room. My fingers tightened around my glass, but I didn't move. She continued, eyes gleaming. Not everyone could survive bankruptcy with such grace. Most people would hide from it, but not you. You're brave enough to sit here with your head held high. A few guests exchanged uneasy glances. Thomas's jaw clenched. Amelia, he whispered, that's enough. Oh, relax, she said lightly. It's not a secret, is it? I mean, public records and all? We should celebrate honesty. I could feel the room's discomfort spreading like smoke. The laughter from earlier was gone, replaced by silence thick enough to choke on. I took a slow breath, letting her finish. Amelia smiled wider, sensing victory. It's inspiring, really, she said. To lose everything and still pretend like nothing happened? That's a kind of courage. I set my glass down gently, the sound sharp in the quiet. You're right, I said. Courage comes in many forms. Her eyebrows lifted. I knew you'd agree. I smiled. I do. Especially with people who think they know everything. Her smile faltered. I stood slowly, my chair scraping softly against the floor. Since we're sharing truths tonight, I said, reaching for the silver box by the tree, I think it's only fair that I share one too. The room seemed to hold its breath. Candlelight flickered across Amelia's face, her confidence cracking for the first time. I placed the silver box on the table in front of me and untied the ribbon. You reminded everyone of my bankruptcy, Amelia. Thank you for that. It's good to keep history accurate. But you forgot to mention the rest of the story. Her eyes darted to Thomas, then back to me. What are you doing? She whispered. I looked at her calm and steady, finishing the meal. Then I lifted the lid. The room fell silent, except for the faint sound of the fire crackling in the hearth, the air thick with something electric. She'd built her moment carefully, but so had I. The dessert was waiting, and so was the truth. Amelia stood frozen for a heartbeat, her glass of wine trembling in her hand. Oh, come on, Richard, she said with a nervous laugh. You didn't have to bring a gift. That's really not necessary. On the contrary, I said, setting the silver box on the table. It's long overdue. Everyone leaned forward, curiosity cutting through the awkward silence that had settled since her speech. The fire popped in the background. The room smelled of pine and baked sugar. But under it all, something colder lingered, anticipation. Amelia straightened her smile, recovering. Well, this is a surprise, she said, glancing around the table. Maybe it's another one of those thoughtful keepsakes Richard loves to give. Her tone carried a touch of mockery, just enough for her friends to smirk. I didn't respond. I took my time untying the ribbon, my hands steady. Before I open this, I said calmly, I'd like to thank Amelia for her kind words earlier. It's not often someone reminds you how valuable honesty is. Her expression flickered. Of course, she said, her voice brittle. That's what family's for. Exactly, I said. Family should share the truth, especially when the truth changes everything. I lifted the lid and set it aside. Inside was a neatly folded document, a flash drive, and a card. I didn't look at Amelia as I handed the flash drive to Thomas. Son, could you plug this into the TV? There's something I'd like everyone to see. Thomas hesitated. Dad, what is this? Just a little Christmas story, I said quietly. He looked uncertain, but obeyed, inserting the drive into the port. The television came alive, showing the footage from earlier that day. Daniel and me in the office signing contracts, shaking hands. The date and time were stamped in the corner, December 24th, 11:58 a.m. I stepped beside the screen as the clip ended and turned toward the table. Yes, I said clearly, 3 years ago I filed for bankruptcy. Everything Amelia said tonight is true, except for one detail. That bankruptcy wasn't a failure. It was a decision. The room was silent. Forks lay untouched wine glasses, half raised. I continued, voice steady but firm. When my company collapsed, I refused to fire my workers. I sold my home, my car, every asset I had to pay them what they were owed. I didn't lose everything, I gave it away on purpose. A murmur rippled through the guests. Amelia shifted in her chair, her cheeks paling. That's not... Let me finish, I said, cutting her off gently. Because what came after matters more. I nodded toward the screen. That video was taken today. Hale Renovations LLC, my company, just finalized a merger. I now own 40% of it. We employ 80 workers across 3 counties. The same men and women who once worked for me. We rebuilt together. Someone at the table gasped. A few guests began to whisper, their tone shifting from pity to shock. Amelia's hand gripped her wineglass tighter. So I said, smiling faintly, "You were right, Amelia. Bankruptcy did change me. It taught me what kind of people stay when everything's gone, and what kind don't." Her lips parted, but no sound came out. I looked at Thomas, whose face was caught between disbelief and pride. His voice was small. "Dad, you never told me. I wanted you to see it, not just hear it," I said. "Words are cheap. Truth isn't." Amelia laughed, suddenly brittle and strained. "This is ridiculous," she said, standing up. "You planned this just to embarrass me." I looked at her evenly. "No, Amelia. You did that yourself. I just turned the lights on." She flushed, her voice rising. "You've been hiding this, pretending to be some poor old man. You let us think you needed help." "I never asked for help," I replied. "You offered sympathy I didn't need, and pity I never wanted." The tension in the room thickened. Some of the guests looked away uncomfortable. Others watched in quiet fascination, like witnesses to a storm they hadn't expected. Thomas stood his jaw tight. "Amelia, sit down," he said quietly. She turned to him, incredulous. "You're taking his side?" Thomas's voice broke. "You tried to humiliate my father in front of everyone. What side did you think I'd take?" Her face hardened, then crumbled. She looked around the room, searching for support, but found only silence. The people who'd laughed at her jokes an hour ago now avoided her eyes. I stepped closer, keeping my tone calm. "Amelia," I said, "I don't need an apology. I don't even need your understanding. I just needed you to know the truth before you tried to rewrite it." She stared at me, breathing fast. "You're enjoying this?" she whispered. "No," I said softly. "I'm finishing it." Thomas walked to my side, his eyes glistening. "Dad," he said quietly, "I'm sorry." I shook my head. "Don't be. You just needed to see who people become when they think you've lost everything." For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound came from the fireplace, the soft crackle of wood burning down to embers. Amelia slowly sat back down, her confidence gone, her voice trembling. "You could have told me," she said. "And ruin your surprise," I said, smiling faintly. A few people chuckled nervously. Even Thomas couldn't hide a small, incredulous laugh. The tension began to dissolve, replaced by something quieter, respect. I reached into the box one last time and pulled out an envelope. "This," I said, handing it to Thomas, "is my Christmas gift to you. 20% of my shares. I trust you'll take better care of them than I took care of my reputation." He blinked, speechless. "Dad, I use it to build something good," I said. "Something honest." As I spoke, I could feel the room shift. Pity turned to pride and humiliation turned to silence, the kind that comes when people realize they've been wrong about everything. Amelia didn't say another word. Her eyes glistened, and for once she had nothing to perform. She looked smaller somehow, like a person stripped of costume and script. I lifted my glass. To honesty, I said, my voice even. Doesn't always make you popular, but it never leaves you poor. Everyone raised their glasses, slowly, hesitantly at first, then with conviction. Thomas clinked his glass against mine. To honesty, he echoed. I caught Amelia's reflection in the window, her face pale, her jaw set. She wasn't finished processing what had just happened, but that didn't matter. Her stage was gone, her audience lost. When I sat down, the warmth of the fire reached me again. The storm had passed, leaving the room strangely peaceful. Amelia had tried to make me small, but instead, she had made me whole again. I looked at my son beside me, then at the silver box now empty on the table. The truth was out, and for the first time in years, I felt light. The show was over. The rest was just silence. No one spoke for several seconds after I sat down. The lights from the Christmas tree flickered faintly against the walls, casting soft colors over faces that didn't know what to do, half stunned, half fascinated. The silence stretched until Thomas finally cleared his throat and said quietly, "Dad, what you did, it's—" I lifted a hand. "It's just truth, son. Nothing more." Amelia was still standing. Her cheeks were flushed, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to keep her composure. "So this is what you wanted?" she asked. "You came here to humiliate me, to what make me look foolish." I looked up at her calm, almost tired. "No, Amelia. I came here to eat dinner with my family. You just happened to schedule a performance for the same time." A few people shifted in their seats, trying not to smile. Someone coughed quietly. Thomas reached for Amelia's hand, but she pulled it back, eyes darting around the table. "You set me up," she said, voice rising. "You knew I was going to talk about you. You wanted this to happen." "I didn't have to want it," I said. "You gave me the timing yourself." Her voice cracked. "You think you're better than me? Because you hid behind silence? Because you let everyone think you were some tragic old man?" I leaned forward slightly. "No, Amelia. I don't think I'm better. But I do think I learned something you never did, what people reveal when they think they're winning." Her eyes glistened. The room felt smaller now, the air thick with the weight of what had been said. The guests tried to look anywhere but at her. One of Thomas's cousins stood up awkwardly, muttering something about checking on the kids, and slipped away. Thomas looked at me helplessly. "Dad, maybe we should—" I turned to him gently. "It's all right, son. Let her speak. She's earned that." Amelia opened her mouth, but no words came out. Whatever confidence she had built was crumbling. The sound of the fire filled the space between us. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You made me look like a fool." "No," I said softly. "You made yourself look honest for the first time tonight." The words hung in the air, quiet but absolute. She sank slowly back into her chair, eyes fixed on her plate. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the wineglass before her. Thomas rubbed his forehead, exhaling hard. "I don't even know what to say," he murmured. "Then don't," I replied. "Sometimes silence says exactly what needs to be said." A few guests began to talk softly again, the way people do when they're trying to escape the aftermath of something they don't understand. The sound of children laughing faintly from the other room broke the tension a little. I sat back, feeling the stiffness in my shoulders ease. Amelia didn't move. Her fork rested untouched beside her plate. She stared at the tablecloth like she could undo the last 10 minutes by sheer will. When she finally looked up, her voice was trembling but sharp. "You think you won, don't you?" I met her gaze and smiled faintly. "Amelia, this isn't a contest. I've spent enough of my life building things that matter to know one thing. You can't win anything that doesn't have value." She looked like she wanted to argue, but the words caught in her throat. Thomas reached for her hand again, and this time she didn't pull away. He turned to me. "Dad, I'm sorry for what she said, for not stopping it sooner." I shook my head. "Don't apologize for someone else's choices, just learn from them." He nodded slowly. His eyes filled with a quiet shame I hadn't seen since he was a boy who'd broken something he couldn't fix. "You didn't deserve that." I know I said, voice soft, but sometimes people need to see what you deserve before they remember who you are. The fire crackled louder. I stood and poured myself another glass of wine. "To be honest, I didn't come here to prove anything," I said, turning toward the group. "I came here because I missed my family. I came here to see my son, my grandkids, to sit at a table and remember what Christmas used to mean." Truth just happened to join us for dinner. A few people chuckled quietly, the tension loosening. Amelia stayed silent, eyes red, hands gripping her napkin. Thomas looked around, his voice steadier now. "Dad, that company Hale Renovations, it's really yours?" "Yes," I said. "And now it's partly yours too. I made sure of it." He blinked, caught off guard. You did that for me." "I did it for the name," I said. "But you carry that name now, so yes, I suppose I did it for you too." He swallowed hard. "Thank you." The clock on the wall ticked softly. I could feel the night starting to exhale, the tension leaving like steam from a kettle. I raised my glass again. "To new beginnings," I said. "And to old truths that never die." Everyone followed their voices, uneven but sincere. The moment felt smaller than I'd imagined it would, but somehow more complete. The revenge had already done its work. What remained wasn't triumph. It was peace. Amelia rose quietly. "Excuse me," she said, and slipped out of the room. The sound of the front door opening echoed through the hall, followed by the faint slam of cold air. No one went after her. Thomas looked torn, his eyes flicking toward the door, then back to me. "Should I?" "No," I said gently. "She needs space. Let her have it." He nodded slowly and sat down again. The guests began to talk softly about ordinary things, dessert, the weather, the snow outside. The world was slowly returning to normal, as if the storm had passed, and all that remained was stillness. I looked toward the window where snowflakes were falling again, slow and deliberate, covering the street in a clean white sheet. For a moment I saw my reflection there, older, yes, but steady. The kind of man who'd finally stopped fighting for validation. Thomas stood beside me a moment later. "Dad," he said quietly, "you could have destroyed her tonight." "You didn't." I turned toward him. "I didn't need to," I said. "The truth did that for me." He nodded, his voice almost a whisper. "I get it now." I smiled faintly and put a hand on his shoulder. "Good," I said. "Then maybe next Christmas we can skip the theatrics and just eat dinner." He laughed softly, and for the first time all night, it felt real. The room had warmth again, not from the fire, but from the silence that followed honesty, as the laughter spread quietly around the table. I glanced once more toward the door where Amelia had left. Outside, the snow kept falling, erasing footprints as quickly as they formed. The world, it seemed, was very good at giving second chances if you were willing to stop lying to yourself long enough to see them. The night after the dinner, I didn't sleep much. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that sits heavy on your chest. I poured myself a glass of water and sat by the window watching snow drift down in lazy spirals beneath the streetlight. Somewhere across town, I imagined Amelia sitting awake too, realizing that truth doesn't fade when the guests go home. It lingers. It follows you. By morning, the storm had stopped. The world outside looked freshly painted white rooftops, clean sidewalks, sunlight reflecting like glass. I stepped outside in my robe, coffee steaming in my hand, and let the cold air hit my face. It was sharp, but alive. I hadn't felt that awake in years. For once, I didn't feel the weight of being misunderstood. The silence felt like peace instead of punishment. I spent most of the morning tidying up the small living room. The silver box sat on the mantel empty now, its ribbon folded neatly beside it. It had done its job. I thought about throwing it away, but something stopped me. Maybe it was a reminder of what happens when you stop defending yourself and let the truth do the talking. Around noon, the phone rang. It was Thomas. His voice sounded heavier than usual. "Dad," he said quietly, "I just wanted to check on you. Last night was a lot." "I'm fine," I said. "Better than I've been in years." He hesitated. "Amelia left early this morning, said she needed space. I don't know if she's coming back." I took a slow sip of coffee. Then give her the space she asked for. He sighed. I feel like I failed both of you. You didn't fail anyone, son, I said. Sometimes people have to lose what they built to realize what it was worth. There was silence on the other end. Then he said softly, She wasn't always like that, you know. When we first met, she was kind. She wanted to prove herself. I think she started comparing too much our life, our money, our status. And then she started using it to hurt. Comparison's a thief, Thomas, I said. It steals gratitude first, then everything else. He didn't answer for a while. I could hear him exhale. You were calm last night. How did you do that? I've been through worse storms, I said. And I learned one thing: when someone throws fire, the worst thing you can do is hand them fuel. He let out a quiet laugh, one that sounded half like relief. You always know what to say. No, I said. I just had more years to learn what not to say. That evening, Thomas came over. He didn't call first, just knocked softly and stood there holding 2 paper cups of coffee. Thought you'd like a refill, he said. We sat at the small kitchen table. Outside, the sun was setting early, staining the snow gold and pink. For a while, neither of us said much. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It felt like repair. I don't know what to do next, he admitted finally. Everything feels strange now. The house is quiet. The kids asked where Amelia went. I didn't know how to answer. Tell them their mom needs time, I said. And that grown-ups sometimes have to relearn what kindness means. He nodded, looking down at his hands. Do you think she'll come back? I think she'll try, I said. The question is whether she'll come back as the same person. He rubbed his temples. I can't believe I didn't see it sooner. You saw it, I said. You just didn't want to. Love has a way of blurring what's in front of you. You inherited that from me. He looked up and smiled faintly. I guess we both loved the wrong people the right way. I laughed softly. That's a good way to put it. After he left, I went out for a drive. The streets were quiet, stores closing early for the holiday. The radio played soft jazz, the kind I used to listen to in my truck between job sites. Every corner I passed brought back memories of the men I worked beside the houses. We built the smell of sawdust and paint in winter air. Those were the days I missed. Not the money, not the recognition, just the work that meant something. When I got back home, the answering machine light was blinking. There was a single message. I pressed play. Mr. Hale, this is Daniel. I just wanted to say, the announcement went everywhere today. The local paper picked up the story about Hale Renovations. They're calling you the man who rebuilt his company from integrity. Thought you'd get a kick out of that. I smiled to myself. Integrity, I muttered. Not a bad headline. I turned off the lamp and let the living room settle into soft darkness. The glow from the Christmas tree painted the walls with color. For the first time, I didn't feel alone in the house. I felt balanced. Like I'd finally stepped out from under something heavy. The next morning, Thomas called again. His voice sounded lighter. Dad, the paper ran that story Daniel mentioned. Amelia must have seen it, she called me. Said she didn't know what to say. What did you tell her? Nothing, he said. I just listened. Maybe for the first time, that's all she needed. That's good, I said. People remember who they are when someone finally listens instead of reacts. He was quiet for a moment. You really don't hate her, do you? No, I said. I don't hate anyone. Hate keeps you tethered to the past. I'm too old for anchors. He laughed softly. You're impossible to argue with. That's experience, not stubbornness. When the call ended, I sat by the window again. Snow was melting on the roofs, dripping down in steady rhythm. The neighborhood was still. Somewhere a child was building another snowman. Life was already moving on. I thought of Amelia, of how she had looked when she realized the truth had turned on her. There was fear in her eyes, but something else too: recognition. Maybe that was what redemption looked like at its start. The shock of realizing the story you tried to control was never yours to own. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt quiet, inside the kind of quiet that comes after a long fight when you finally set the weight down. That night I wrote a note to myself and tucked it inside the old notebook on my desk. Revenge isn't about punishment. It's about peace, and peace doesn't need an audience. Outside, the wind had died, and the last bit of snow glowed under the streetlight like silver dust. I sat there until the house went completely still, the faint ticking of the clock the only sound left. The storm had passed. All that remained was calm. Thomas came by 2 days after Christmas. The snow had started melting, turning the roads into slush and the air into a wet chill that clung to everything. He didn't call first, just showed up at my door with 2 coffees and that hesitant smile of his, the one he used to wear when he was a kid, bringing home bad report cards. "Mind if I come in?" he asked. "You brought coffee," I said. "You're already forgiven." He laughed softly and stepped inside, brushing snow from his jacket. The house smelled faintly of pine and old paper. I hadn't taken the tree down yet. The lights still blinked lazily in the corner, half the bulbs dead. He sat at the table, took a slow sip, and looked at me with that quiet, searching look that always comes before a difficult question. "Dad," he said finally, "I've been thinking about what happened, and I need to know something. Why didn't you tell anyone the truth before about the bankruptcy, about the company? You could have stopped all of this." I leaned back, my coffee cooling between my hands. "Because truth doesn't need a stage, son. It just needs time." He frowned. "I don't get it." I looked out the window. The sky was gray and low, pressing down on the rooftops. When I filed for bankruptcy, people thought I'd lost everything. Maybe I wanted them to think that. It made things quieter. I didn't know explanations anymore, and for once in my life, I had room to build something without anyone watching. "You mean Hale renovations?" "Yeah," I said, smiling faintly. That was the second act. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "But what really happened back then, Dad? You've never told me the whole story." I let out a slow breath. "All right. You deserve the truth." I stood, walked to the cabinet, and pulled down an old metal tin from the top shelf. Inside were a few faded photos, a key, and a folded letter. I placed them on the table. 3 years ago, the company was in trouble. We'd taken on too many projects, and one of my partners, remember Greg Simmons, he'd been cutting corners, cooking invoices. When I found out, I had 2 choices: fight him in court or shut everything down before he took the rest of us with him. Thomas's eyes widened. "You never told me that." "I didn't want to drag you through it," I said. "Greg had friends in high places. If I'd gone public, it would have destroyed everyone working for me. People who had nothing to do with his lies. I couldn't do that to them. So you just took the fall." "I didn't take the fall," I said quietly. "I took responsibility. There's a difference. I sold everything, paid off what I could, and filed for bankruptcy so my employees could walk away clean. The company name went down, but their names stayed clear. It was the only way to end it with some kind of dignity." Thomas sat back, processing it. The clock ticked softly in the corner. "And you never told anyone?" "Only Daniel," I said. "He was the one who helped me rebuild after." We started small renovations, repairs, nothing fancy. I told him I wanted to do things differently this time. No shortcuts. No partners who only cared about profit. We built it brick by brick, quietly, under a new name. He nodded slowly. That's why you called it Hale Renovations. Not for the money, I said. For the redemption. Thomas was quiet for a long time. He turned the old key in his hand. You know, all these years, I thought you were hiding because you were ashamed. I smiled faintly. I was hiding because I wasn't done yet. He let out a long breath and shook his head. You're something else, Dad. I chuckled. Just stubborn. We sat there for a while, sipping our coffee, the air thick with quiet understanding. Then he asked softly, Do you ever regret it? Losing everything to save everyone else. I looked at the photos spread across the table, faces of men I'd worked beside for decades. No. Money comes and goes. But your name, that's the only thing you die with. He nodded, his voice low. I get it now. What you did, it wasn't weakness, it was strength. Strength is just doing the right thing when no one's clapping, I said. That's all. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small envelope. I have something for you, he said. I opened it and found a copy of the newspaper article from the day before. The headline read, Local Builder Rebuilds from the Ground Up Honor Before Profit. Underneath was a photo of me and Daniel, shaking hands in the office. The caption called me a quiet man who never stopped believing in integrity. I laughed softly. I never liked that word, integrity. Sounds too clean. Real integrity gets dirty sometimes. Thomas smiled. Still, it's true. We sat in silence again, the kind that doesn't need filling. Outside, the clouds broke apart, letting a few streaks of sunlight spill through. Dust floated in the golden light between us, like little pieces of time refusing to settle. Finally, I slid the folded letter across the table. Your mother wrote this before she passed. I've kept it all these years. He unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the neat handwriting. When he finished, he looked up, eyes wet. She wrote, If life ever takes everything from you, remember, character rebuilds faster than fortune. I nodded. She always had a way with words. Thomas blinked back tears. She'd be proud of you, Dad. She'd be proud of you too, I said. You stood up last night when it counted. That's more than most ever do. He smiled weakly. I didn't do much. You listened, I said. That's harder than talking. He folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the tin, and stood. You know, I always thought Christmas was about gifts, he said. But I think it's about seeing people clearly. I finally saw you last night for who you really are. I stood too, resting a hand on his shoulder. Then it was worth everything. He hugged me tight and sudden, like he was afraid if he let go, the moment would fade. I held him there for a while, the way I used to when he was a boy, scared of thunderstorms. When he left, the house felt warmer somehow. The snow outside had stopped melting, frozen again in patches of light. I sat back at the table, the newspaper still open to that headline. I ran my thumb over the words, honor before profit. For a moment, I closed my eyes and saw her face, my wife, smiling, nodding like she knew this ending all along. We did it, I whispered. Not perfectly, but we did it right. The wind picked up again outside, carrying the sound of church bells from down the street. I raised my coffee cup toward the empty chair across from me. Here's to the long way home, I said. And for the first time in years, I meant every word. The morning light came through the blinds in thin gold lines stretching across the kitchen table, where my coffee steamed beside the newspaper. Outside, the world was quiet. The last of the snow clung to the trees, melting slowly under a weak winter sun. It was the kind of calm that only comes after a storm. The kind that doesn't feel empty, just peaceful. I had the day off, though. I wasn't sure what off meant anymore. For years, my life had been work deadlines and the next contract. Then, it became silence. Now it was something else, a middle ground I hadn't known how to find until recently. I turned off the radio just to hear the house breathe. The clock ticked softly. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once and then stopped. Everything felt new and familiar all at once. There was a knock at the door around 8. When I opened it, Thomas stood there holding 2 cups of coffee and a bakery bag that smelled like cinnamon. "You said to bring coffee," he said. Smiling a little. "I did, didn't I?" I stepped aside and let him in. "You're learning?" He laughed. "Took me long enough." We sat by the window, the one that looked out over the neighborhood, where nothing ever really changed. The snow plows had left neat lines of gray ice along the curbs, and kids were already out throwing snowballs in front of the school bus. Life kept moving even after everything. Thomas handed me one of the coffees. "Daniel called," he said. "He said the merger paperwork's been finalized. You're officially back in business." I took a sip and smiled. "Feels strange hearing that. I thought I was done with building things." "You're never done," he said. "You just build different kinds of things now." He was right. Maybe I wasn't building houses anymore, but I was rebuilding something else, trust, reputation, a name that meant something again. I didn't need the applause or the headlines. I just needed the work to mean something. For a while, we sat in silence. Then Thomas leaned back and said, "You know, Amelia called me." I looked up from my coffee, and she's staying with her sister for now. Said she's sorry. Said she didn't realize how much she hurt you or me. I nodded slowly. Sometimes people don't realize what they're breaking until they see the pieces. He sighed. "I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know if I can forgive her yet." "You will," I said. "Forgiveness isn't a gift you give to others. It's one you give yourself." He stared at me for a long moment, then smiled faintly. "You always manage to sound like you've been through every kind of storm." "I've been through enough to know you can't control them," I said. "But you can decide what kind of man you'll be when they pass." He nodded, taking another sip of coffee. The sunlight caught the side of his face, and for the first time in a long time, he looked peaceful. "Dad," he said softly, "last week I would have said Christmas was ruined. But somehow it feels like it saved something instead." I smiled. That's what truth does. It ruins what's false and saves what's real. We talked for a while about work, the kids, the plans for New Year's. It was easy conversation, the kind we hadn't had in years. When he finally stood to leave, he paused at the door. "You're not really going back to full-time work, are you?" I chuckled. "No, I'm staying on for a while just to guide things. After that, it's yours to shape. You and Daniel." His eyes softened. "You really mean it?" "I do. Just promise me one thing." "What's that?" "Build things that last. Not just walls, relationships, choices, your word. They'll outlive anything money can buy." He nodded slowly, his voice steady. "I will." After he left, I sat by the window again, watching his car disappear down the street. The quiet settled back and warm and familiar. I reached for the old notebook on the table and turned to the last page. There were lines from years of lessons scribbled in uneven handwriting. I added one more. "Justice doesn't always make noise. Sometimes it just arrives quietly and stays." I closed the notebook and looked around the house. It wasn't big and it wasn't fancy, but it was mine, every nail, every board, every quiet morning earned honestly. The same sunlight that had once fallen on my construction sites now poured across my kitchen floor, and I realized the work had never really stopped. It had just changed shape. By noon, I decided to walk into town. The air was crisp and the sidewalks were slick in spots, but it felt good to move. The hardware store owner waved as I passed. The diner had its usual crowd, and someone called out, "Hey, Mr. Hale, saw the article about your company." "Good for you." I smiled and tipped my head. "Thank you." Feels good to be back, huh? I thought for a moment before answering. Feels good to be right where I belong. When I got home, the mailman had left a small envelope in the box. Inside was a letter from Daniel, handwritten. You taught me more than how to build houses, it read. You taught me how to build character. Merry Christmas, old friend. I folded the note and set it on the mantel beside the silver box. The ribbon still lay coiled beside it, glinting faintly in the afternoon light. For a long time, I just stood there, letting the warmth from the fire reach me. Later that night, I made myself dinner, nothing fancy, just soup and bread, and sat by the fire with a glass of whiskey. Outside, the snow had started again, soft and quiet, falling through the streetlight like ash from an old fire finally going out. I raised my glass to the empty room. To truth, I said. To second chances. The fire cracked softly like it agreed. If anyone were to ask what revenge felt like, I'd tell them, it doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like balance. It's the peace that comes when the truth finally stands tall enough to cast its own light. I leaned back in the chair, letting the warmth sink in. Somewhere out there, Amelia was learning her own lessons. Thomas was rebuilding his life, and the company I once lost was thriving again. The world kept spinning quietly, righting itself. When I finally turned off the lights and headed upstairs, the house was still. I paused at the window, watching the snow fall across the yard. Merry Christmas, I whispered to no one in particular. And thank you for letting the truth come home. The snow kept falling, covering everything in white, erasing the old tracks, leaving the world clean again.